Mr. President, I rise in opposition to the senator's amendment. All of us recognize that our first obligation as Americans is to ensure the security and well-being, to the extent that we can, of our citizens. And that is our first priority. There are many flaws in the system for admitting people to this country. Those flaws go beyond the problem of people sneaking into our country illegally or overstaying their visas. They extend to the process that we use under the Visa Waiver Program. And indeed, one of our colleagues, Senator Coates, has introduced a thoughtful bill to have us take a better look at that program and whether it is a way for citizens who have been radicalized to come from Western European countries into our country and to do us harm. There are many ways that we can improve the process. I'm working with Senator Cantwell on a bill having to do with biometrics to make sure we have more information. But I look at the senator's amendment, and he lists 34 countries that would be affected by his prohibition. 34 countries. They include countries like Turkey. Turkey is a NATO ally. Turkey is absolutely vital in the war against ISIS. It includes our strong ally, Jordan. If Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon, who have already taken in 4 million refugees who are fleeing from Syria, if they are destabilized, what does that mean for the stability of that entire region? Mr. President, just last month, I went on an official trip with several of my colleagues to get a better understanding of the migrant crisis that is engulfing Europe. We traveled to the 2 countries that are the entry points for many of the refugees who are fleeing conflict in Syria and who also are coming from Afghanistan and Iraq and some countries in Africa as well, like Libya. So we went to Italy and we went to Greece. At that time, in the middle of last month, 710,000 individuals had come in through Greece and to Italy to go on to other countries in Western Europe and in Scandinavia. And we talked to the officials there, and I was not happy with the responses that I received from Greek, Italian, and UN officials about their screening of refugees, even though it was evident that the vast majority of refugees were people who were fearing for their lives and seeking safety. I was worried that ISIS fighters would embed themselves in this flood of refugees. And what the Greeks and the Italians, with help from the UN High Commission on Refugees, were doing was fingerprinting people, taking their photographs, and then essentially sending them on their way. And I asked, are we comparing these fingerprints, these photos, this other information, with the American watch list for terrorists? Are we matching them up against our no-fly list, our TIDE database, which is the larger terrorist watch list? And the answer was no, and that needs to change. But Mr. President, I also traveled to a shelter in Athens that was run by Doctors of the World, an organization with which I was previously unfamiliar. And there I met a very young mother with her adorable little girl. They were from Eritrea, and they had been part of the flood of refugees. They pose no harm to our country or to any of the countries in which they might ultimately settle. And yet they might need a little bit of assistance, a little bit of help, because the mother was so young and her daughter only age 2. I also met 2 young girls from Afghanistan who both said to me, please don't take our pictures and put it on Facebook because we fear for our relatives back in Afghanistan. Look what has happened in Afghanistan as the Taliban has regained strength and now is once again oppressing women and girls, denying them an education, forcing them into early marriages. Another country on this list is Nigeria, certainly a country we have to be very careful about, because this is a country where ISIS has a stronghold and where Boko Haram is located. But it's also the country where hundreds of girls were kidnapped for trying to get an education. In other words, we can't just list 34 countries, some of which are essential to work with us in the war against terrorism, against ISIS, like Jordan, like Turkey. We can't just list all these countries and say that they're off limits. We can't just automatically say no to an Iraqi interpreter who's worked with our special forces and now is in danger of losing his life and having his family slaughtered because he helped to save Americans' lives in Iraq. Are we saying we will not let a single person from 34 countries into our country, no matter how many American lives they have saved, no matter whether or not they pose a threat to us? Now, Mr. President, I want to make very clear, I do not think our process for screening people to come into this country is good enough. It is not. If it were good enough, we would not have people who could cause us harm in this country. But you know, perhaps we should be focusing on those Americans, yes, even Americans, who have become radicalized and have traveled to Syria and Iraq and been trained to plot attacks here in this country. Lone wolf attacks like Major Hassan at Fort Hood, an American citizen who was radicalized online by an extremist Islamic cleric. We can't apply a one-size-fits-all to 34 countries that include a NATO ally and other allies who have been helpful in the war against terrorism, or who include countries that include individuals who have helped the cause, who have saved American lives, or who pose no threats to us, like those 2 young Afghan girls that I met at the shelter, or the very young mother with her very young little girl. We do need to tighten our process. We need to do more. And you know, I would think that members of this body who voted just months ago to weaken our ability, even under court orders, to provide surveillance of those who we suspect would do us harm, would think again about what they have done in this time when the threats coming at us have never been greater. But this is a MEDAX approach. It is too broad, and it does not really address the problem that we face today. We do need to address that problem. Perhaps we need a pause to redo our processes, but this is not the answer. Finally, Mr. President, as I read this language, the way it is written, it may apply to refugees who already have been legally admitted to this country. Do we want to do that? We need to think about this. We need to get this right. And Senator Paul's amendment is far too broad and is not the right answer to what is a real problem. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.